Thank you all for being here and for recognizing with your presence the importance of this topic, but also the necessity of having this conversation here in a school of education. When this panel was being developed, I think there was a lot of care taken to not only the topic and title and participants, but also the significance of having this conversation at a moment when so many of our alumni and so many of our admitted students would be here, and to really be engaged in a conversation about what do schools of education have to say, what roles can we play in addressing, affecting, and reimagining what is happening in the context of gun violence in this country. What we would like to do today is to truly have a conversation, first amongst ourselves, and then to invite you to engage in conversation with us. To kick off that conversation, we actually wanted to start with the voice of a young person. So I'm going to play a clip. I'm not going to play the whole thing, just a couple minutes of a clip of a young man who spoke at the March for Our Lives. And we're going to listen to it, and I think it's going to help frame the conversation we're going to have together.
I want to start off with a chant. Everybody repeat after me. Everyday shootings are everyday problems. No, that was a little weak, everybody. I need stronger than that. Everyday shootings are everyday problems. Now, make sure everybody watches and hears us. Everyday shootings are everyday problems. My name is Trevon Bosley, and I'm here with the brave youth leaders of St. Sabina, and I'm here to speak on behalf of Chicago's youth who are surrounded and affected by gun violence every day. I'm here to speak for those youth who fear they may be shot while going to the gas station, the movies, the bus stop, to church, or even to and from school. I'm here to speak for those Chicago youth who feel their voices have been silenced for far too long. And I'm here to speak on behalf of everyone that believes a child getting shot and killed in Chicago or any other city is still a not acceptable norm. Most importantly, I'm here to speak on behalf of my brother, Terrell Bosley, who was shot and killed while leaving church April 4, 2006. Just to give you guys a few stats from Chicago, since 2006, there have been more than 5,850 people shot and killed in Chicago. And since 2012, there have been more than 16,000 people shot. Now, let me repeat that one more time. Since 2006, there have been more than 5,850 people shot and killed in Chicago. And since 2012, there have been more than 16,000 people shot in Chicago. These stats are not just numbers in the speech. These are mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters. On a societal proportion, these are lawyers, doctors, artists, musicians. And more than anything else, these are lives cut short due to senseless gun violence. I must add, though, Chicago's violence epidemic didn't start overnight. It was caused by many problems that we are still not dealing with to this day. When you have a city that feels it's more important to help pay for a college and sports complex rather than fund schools and impoverished communities, you have gun violence. When you have a city that feels we need more diggy bikes in downtown Chicago for tourists rather than more funding for workforce programs that get guys off the streets real jobs, you have gun violence. When you have an Illinois state governor, Bruce Rauner, who feels that funding anti-violence programs is, I quote, non-essential spending, you have gun violence. When you have elected officials who feel that getting a few extra dollars from the NRA is more important than their actual constituents, you have gun violence. And when you have a president that would rather constantly talk about and belittle Chicago's violence than rather than send funds and resources, you have gun violence. It's time for the nation to realize gun violence is more than just a Chicago problem or a Parkland problem, but it's an American problem. We are here.
So I'd like to leave Trevon on the background. And Sonali, if you will, you've done some work trying to contextualize violence in the lives of young people, and from a health perspective, from someone who's been thinking about school climate, thinking about young people, how they experience education. I wonder if you could help put the problem, as it were, in context in terms of young people, education, and schools.
Okay, absolutely. So again, just to echo what Lalitha said, it's a privileged to be here today to speak about this issue, particularly as faculty and students in a school of education, but also to see you all here on a Saturday that shows the importance of this issue and the importance of having this discussion. I've been privileged to be able to do a lot of work in this area, in large part with Lalitha and other colleagues here at TC, but also at other institutions. This looks awkward if I hold this, right? So I'll just go like that. Okay. So I actually started thinking about the issue of gun violence and gun violence in schools in a little bit of a sort of circuitous way. My research really focuses on school health issues more broadly. So what that means is I am generally interested in how the health of a child and a student impacts what happens in the classroom. That means everything from what they eat for breakfast that day, how they slept the night before, what their mental health is like, what's going on with their peers, are they feeling engaged in their classroom, are they using substances, illicit drugs. So you kind of think about the gamut of what we all need on a day-to-day basis to feel good, to come to work, to engage as in our communities. And so we need to be able to provide that for our students as well. And I kept coming back to this in my research and in my practice in terms of working with a number of schools here in New York City in particular, and realizing that if kids fundamentally don't feel safe, then we cannot expect them to eat well at lunch or to sleep well at night or to test or to honestly do anything. And my career here as a faculty has sadly coincided with a lot of sensationalized, I'm going to use that word a bit loosely, but a sensationalized school shooting. So we think Sandy Hook happened my first semester here as a faculty. We think about Las Vegas, which happened. We think about the Pulse nightclub shootings. We think about all of these really sort of high-profile mass shootings that happened. And then, of course, several that have happened in schools, of course, during this time. So that really is how I started thinking about this issue. Gun violence historically, gun violence prevention has really been studied and spearheaded by folks in the public health, injury prevention, and emergency medicine arenas. And Lord knows they have done for decades now a lot of the important groundwork for understanding this issue, for being able to even contextualize the conversations we're having in real data. But as Lalitha and I have been talking about, and my colleagues here today, we've been talking about quite a bit, is why are schools of education, why are educators, why are teachers, why are school professionals not having a voice on this issue in the way that other professions are? And this is a school issue. This is an education issue, because when you think about how we educate our children, we think about their well-being. And if kids feel like, as is so beautifully articulated in the clip you just saw, if they are worried about gun violence in their communities, that sort of bidirectionality between what's happening in their communities and then what's then happening in their schools, that's going to impact their learning and their ability to be a student. And we as educators would be failing them if we didn't address this and think about this issue as an education, as a school health issue. So that's sort of how I think we came to this as a topic, and kind of one of the frameworks we used in pulling this panel together.
And Mark, I know your work sort of thinking about the structures of schooling and policy. I wonder if you could give some additional context for some of the remarks that Sonali made as well, in terms of how young people do or don't feel safe and the impact of that in terms of how they experience schooling and from a kind of a policy and structural perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Lalitha. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of training leaders. And to be frank, those are folks that I feel have a huge responsibility in making schools feel safe. Now, we have to be clear about what that means, because I want to go through this very slowly, making schools safe for all kids. A lot of my work support kids who have been minoritized in schools. And so there's a racialization of this whole issue around safety. Let me try to tell you a really quick narrative to make my point. So in 1998, I was starting my doctoral program at The Ohio State University. Go Bucks. And in 1999, anybody know what happens around school violence in 1999? You remember? Columbine, right? So my dissertation really was starting to look at all of these school violence instances around the country, right? These mass shootings. And what was interesting about the mass shootings is that all of the people who committed these mass shootings and also where they took place, all right? All of the people who committed them were white males at that time, all right? And all of the areas where they took place were in suburban spaces. And almost to 100%, every time they would interview somebody, people would say, this was not supposed to happen here, right? And so there's always this implied thing, if it wasn't supposed to happen here, where was it supposed to happen, right? So then you have this logical mismatch. If mass shootings, which really shock the consciousness, and as Sonali was saying, we don't want to minimize the loss, and as Trevon said on the video, people lose their lives and communities are hurt by this. But mass shootings happen in one place, one type of school district, and then strictures increase in another type of school district. And those districts, more often than not, are really occupied by kids who kids who are of African or Latino descent. So anyway, you got this logical mismatch, right? And I'm saying we need to think about why that is the case. The same thing when it comes to school safety. There are people who feel like school safety requires that we exclude African American and Latino kids and Native American kids primarily, because people have seen them as the problem historically, right? So what happens is the responses really are constructed around getting those kids out of the educational space, which really pushes against making schools feel safe and inclusive for that particular group of kids, while at the same time not really addressing the broader issue, if that makes sense. So my work really challenges leaders to think about their racial awareness and how that impacts their practice. Because I'm a firm believer that if you haven't interrogated your race and you are leading a school, you really have incomplete training. You haven't done everything that you need to do to really address these issues. Because I want to be very clear, these issues are racialized and have been for a very long time. And if we don't address them, we're going to continue to have things like, for example, 16% of the students in the population are African American. However, they make up 33% of first-time suspensions. You got to think about that. They're 16% of the population, but they make up 33% of the first-time suspensions, which then starts a trend, a personal trend in the life of that child. They make up 42% of those kids who are suspended for the second time, all right? African American and Latino males are 51% of the kids who are arrested in schools, and I did say arrested. We're taking kids out in handcuffs now when they're in pre-K. That's what we're doing in school areas, and we're calling that safety. We're saying we're making it more safe and secure. So I really push back against that. We need to be really more sophisticated in our interrogation of the structures and the process. Otherwise, we're going to have folks come into the space telling us as educators how we can run this space. You have people who have become safety and security experts who have no educational background. So they'll tell you, yeah, when a kid yells at a teacher, put the cuffs on them. Not developmentally appropriate, not okay on a, think about it. I have a 10-year-old daughter. Anybody comes in here with handcuffs, we're gonna have some issues, right? So, but we don't think about those parents who have less power in the system. We say, this is what's best for your kids. And so last but not least, we also have people who have structured schools in ways that are really, rather than based on what kids need to develop and making these environments caring and nurturing places, they've structured them around compliance. You come to school, we teach you how to comply, right? As a matter of fact, when you say Chicago, I've been in touch with some of the educators from Chicago, and there are a number of schools that have this military bent, if you will, right? And so people are telling parents, this is what your kid needs. If you have an African-American male, we got to keep them out of the system. So this is how we need to treat them. If you talk to kids and really get a concept of what they think about justice, they'll really tell you, this feels very much like a prison. There are a lot of things here that feel really, really restrictive. So we have to start to really push down into that space and interrogate the structures and then think about what is meant by safety and security and who is excluded from the educational community as a result of somebody's safety and security being maintained.
Mark, you're raising such important questions, and I think it builds on the kind of landscape Sonali gave us to kind of contend with, to reckon with. And one of the points you just talked about, it makes me think that there's always almost this kind of language baked into the policies that are kind of primordial to schooling at this point. And I know, Claudia, you have done a lot of work trying to get people to have discussions that do something, that penetrate, I think, in a way that Mark is inviting school leaders in particular, but people who are part of a school community to do, which is get beyond a kind of almost sophomoric understanding of safety to actions that address and attend to the broadest sense of who is a part of a school community. And he's introduced ideas of inclusion and belonging, but he's also, I think, invited us to really reckon with what Trevon, this young man, and so many young people reckon with, which is how are they seen implicitly by a school structure, and how does that come out in the way people talk about them? I wonder if you could just say a few words and add to this kind of invitation to think about response to gun violence in our schools and in our communities, by helping us think about how does real meaningful talk happen that leads us to actual change, and not just these kinds of bandages that actually reinforce harmful approaches to addressing young people's safety.
Okay, thank you. We had a wonderful conversation the other day, which really got me thinking and gave me some insights into what some of my colleagues have been up to around this topic. I'm a bit of an outlier. I don't study schools, I study organizations. Now you could say schools are an organization, and they certainly are. But I do study how do you bring people together to have conversations. And previously I thought about it primarily in terms of the red-blue divide in our culture, and how if we keep not using the same kind of language, if those on the blue, those on the left, are only talking about gun control, and those on the right are talking about freedom, we're going to have a problem hearing one another. And applying that to the conversation about schools, one thing that became very clear to me in hearing each of my colleagues speak is the necessity of educators' voices being part of this broader conversation about safety. School safety, yes, but safety in general, safety for children in general, and how to get to the root of what creates this violent system and all the complexities having to do with race and privilege and stereotypes. So my prescription, if I had the power to give one, would be for there to be a strong public hunger and push for conversations that include young people who we see are profoundly capable of speaking for their experience of the trauma that they're facing and the impact it has on them. Teachers, school leaders, parents, law enforcement folk, and politicians, because one of the things I spoke about when we chatted the other day was the cognitive psychology has discovered that when you appeal to people's worst instincts, when you go for those polarizing zingers that we hear. I have a quick example. So this is the March for Our Lives, and one publication, you can guess if this is a red or a blue publication. One publication said, "Brainwashed teens lead anti-freedom march." Any guesses? Versus, "Conservatives belittle marchers while the NRA peddles conspiracy theories about them." A bluer publication. So I don't want to go there, but I want to bring the notion of the power of storytelling and hearing the voices of people who are experiencing an issue as a way of breaking down divisions. When we hear the complexity of an issue and we don't just read headlines like this or stay in our own information bubble, we use a more complex style of thinking. Danny Kahneman, a cognitive psychologist, calls it thinking fast and slow. When we think fast, we rely on stereotypes. We rely on baked-in preconceptions that we have, some of which are very poorly founded, or they're based on newspaper headlines or our own experience, which is limited. When we hear stories, when we come together with people who've had different experiences, we use a different part of our brain. We think more, we're using less of the reptilian brain and more of our neocortex to really do the kind of complex thinking that these very complex societal problems require. So that would be my wish, is to bring people together in conversation.
You mentioned teachers, and I know, Jennifer, you work with pre-service and I think current teachers, is that? And when we spoke earlier on the phone this week, one of the things that you talked about was the ways in which the teachers you're working with are newly engaging with their own role, sort of being thrust out there. One of the images, one of the phrases I really don't like used to describe teachers is that they're on the front lines. And you know, we can discuss why that's a problematic image. But in a way, their role is being militarized as well. And I wonder, in light of how Claudia has talked about the importance of having all of these voices, can you say a little bit about what you're hearing, and also sort of what the conversations have been with the teachers you're working with as they contend with this new heightened awareness, but not new reality, as Trevon has reminded us, this new heightened awareness?
Sure, and a little bit of what I'll tell you kind of merges what Mark said about race visibility and race, critical race awareness among teacher identity, as well as what you're talking about with breaking the deadlock of discourse. And to give you a quick background, I came to this problem not by choice, but as a young person who was impacted by a family shooting at a very young age. And we lost my father's brother to a nightclub shooting in which he died in my father's arms. So at 8, I was very aware that the scene could change in an instant. So my mind has definitely developed differently under those conditions to always, we had talked about the psychic load of understanding that there's at any moment something, it will switch from being safe to unsafe, and a hypervigilance that comes with having post-traumatic stress disorder. So through my own therapy work, I felt it would be a wonderful idea to work in schools where children were traumatized, and I picked some of the most difficult schools. Some of those experiences helped me, but on the other hand, not having gone through some of the race privilege work also limited me drastically. But there is one thing that the teachers and I had in common, is that we understood the duress of students and the instantaneous possibility that things could become unsafe at the drop of a hat. And communities of color or communities impacted historically by violence have had to grapple with this issue and recover around it for far longer. And there are much more many answers and resources to glean from communities who have already worked on this issue before it's become something so broadly public. So I live in Connecticut, which is considered Sandy Hook country, so to speak. We the school where I work at now has a very close relationship to several Sandy Hook mothers, and we're doing social emotional learning training with our teachers with them, and also bringing those programs into local schools. What was interesting about Sandy Hook for my colleagues and I is that we had been working in schools where there were already shootings and lockdowns, and that was regular, and we had become burnt out and desensitized to that, and so had our kids. When Sandy Hook happened, I watched colleagues who were working in different communities suddenly freak out, and it was their turn. It was just their turn to freak out and have and kind of get that same perforated, unfortunately, that puncture of we're not safe, right? And then I watched them start to go through similar phases that I've watched the kids go through and myself go through, and it was unfortunate. The harder part has been politically that now the newsreel and the government discourse tends to say teachers need to fix this. So I have big issue with the labor being on teachers' shoulders. I have pre-service teachers in my classrooms who are about to go into the field with all of this hope, and they're going in at a time when this is happening, watching the news and coming into my classroom going, my mom and dad called last night and they think I should switch my major because they want to know what you're going to do to help keep me safe. And I don't know what to tell them. So our response has been very that, one, this is an interdisciplinary conversation. This is not something that should be left on the shoulders of teachers or students, not to discredit at all the activism work that's being done. But there's a lot to do, and it's so complex. We know from the conversations we've had and what we've heard is that this isn't an issue of school shootings, and this isn't an issue of strictly race. This is an issue of a nation's reliance on violence. This is about community and cultural violence, and it's a responsibility for everyone to be involved with. So we have started to quickly on our feet renegotiate our teaching curriculum in response to that, and our students are actually helping with that. There are a few, but they are interested, and I feel like that's another thing to think about is it may start with a few, but we learn in teaching, if you can get one, you could get another, right? And it may not be a massive shift immediately, and especially for pre-service teachers, I worry so much because it's almost like they don't yet know what they're getting themselves into politically as activists. They're just trying to learn what curriculum and instruction is, and now they're like, this is so political, I wasn't prepared for that. And it's almost reshaping teacher ed to say, yes, it's very political, that this job is highly political, and for that to be up front.
I'm gonna give a question for all of you to consider, and it's really brief. And it's, so what do we do? But before you answer, I'll give you a couple minutes to kind of ponder your response. And perhaps a more elegant way of saying it is, what ought to be? What would you recommend our response be, given this varied landscape? I wanted to maybe revisit a couple of the key points I heard. And one had to do, we started off really kind of getting a sense that school safety is not something that we can pay lip service to, because young people who are in schools, they're contending with the journey to school and back from school, and that school is not just a building, but it's an institution that permeates community spaces. And so really thinking about safety is important, but we also recognize that safety is not a singular idea, and so often safety is used as a weapon itself to further criminalize and militarize educational spaces that ought to be sites of nurturing, that ought to be sites of community building rather than community fracturing. We know, too, that teachers and students are often put not only at odds with one another, but at odds with leadership, and sort of the front lines language helps to perpetuate that. And we're also seeing that teachers, in the form of other responses that are thrown out there, see-through backpacks, the arming teachers, we'll call it a idea. I can't give it the what's it called?
Bad
the credence
idea.
of debate. Right, and the increase of metal detectors, which have long plagued urban schools, but are now popping up in even more schools, and certainly the presence of law enforcement in schools, which is making the existing symbiotic relationship between law enforcement and schools of education, public schools, even more seamless. And then finally, we have talked about the need for stories to interrupt what are often stereotypes that circulate our immediate responsiveness, right? And how are the stories of violence told? How are they documented? How are they circulated? Whose stories do we listen to? Does media play a role? How do each of us play a role? So that's the sort of landscape we've very quickly traversed, and obviously we could stay in the domain of what is the landscape of gun violence, that it's not a singular moment of bullet-piercing flesh, but it is far more complex. And so with that landscape, I wonder if the panelists could contend with what might some of our responses be, however you see your response to that.
I have a lot of thoughts, as Lalitha will tell you, but I will limit this. So the analogy I always draw, and I shared this with my colleagues here a few days ago when we were discussing our panel, but the analogy I always draw is, imagine if we tried to address the gun violence epidemic in this country the same way we have been trying for now 3 decades to address the obesity epidemic in this country. So for those of you, hello, okay, there, sorry. My health ed folks in the room will know this, of course, but to address the obesity epidemic, we have looked at every angle and thought so creatively and out of the box and sort of in a very systems approach to try and address this as a real public health crisis. So we've looked at individual engagement in, we've looked at, reshaping that food pyramid to be a plate. We've talked about physical activity behaviors. We've looked at the built environment, food deserts, vending machines in schools. We've even tried out a soda ban here in New York City a few years ago. We've looked at policy. We've really thought about, and funders and funding agencies have followed suit. We've really thought about addressing the obesity epidemic. We've looked at epigenetic factors, exposures to environmental pollutants, and that relationship back to obesity. I mean, you name it, we have tried it, we have studied it, we have supported it. You do not see a huge public divide or this sort of emotional discourse prohibiting progress on an issue like obesity, which is a huge public health epidemic and has many, many health and mental well-being and other sorts of ramifications. In fact, we've embraced it as researchers, scholars, practitioners in and out of the education setting. And so one of Lalitha and I, or one of our colleagues, he has often likened this to, he uses the word moonshot. And I think that's so, it's sort of wonderful and hopeful in what is otherwise a very negative conversation or sort of sad conversation. And that is, if we really embraced the solutions to gun violence epidemic in this creative way by looking at the role of green space on crime rates, if by thinking about how to engage in interdisciplinary efforts that look at prevention and not just reactive strategies. Several of the examples that Lalitha shared, which she and I have discussed in some of our own writings, have no grounding in empirical evidence. And so before we start arming teachers and coming up with policies, shouldn't we ask teachers what they think? Shouldn't we test this? Shouldn't we have some sort of basis for how we're coming up with practices? I think for me, the way I think about the long-term solution to the gun violence epidemic is about bringing together a lot of creative solutions that embrace the preventive piece, which is my own bias and kind of where my work lives, but also acknowledging that reactive strategies cannot be reactions to the headlines you see. And I saw that red headline and I had some reactions to it. And even as particularly as researchers in this space, we have to be very mindful of not letting our emotions drive the conversation, but really kind of going back to the data. So that's not a specific solution, rather I think an interesting reframe of how, or hopefully it's interesting for me, hopefully interesting for you, way of thinking about this as a social issue and not as a political or emotional one. And if we can start there, I think a lot of the pieces that we are talking about here today, the solutions to that will emerge almost organically. So.
I would add just the, as a first step, the reframing is essential. I think it was Albert Einstein who had this quote about you really can't solve a problem with the same kind of thinking that created it. So unless we reframe this issue, and what I was hinting at earlier, and now let me be direct, we already have psychological violence occurring in our schools, right? That supports climates of exclusion, right, that really lead to extreme examples of things like gun violence. Now, that said, we need to be mindful that school violence has been decreasing, but disproportionality and suspensions in this country have been increasing. The number of school resource officers that we've been putting in schools, reactionary, has been increasing, right? So once again, kind of thinking about the logical mismatch of that. And in certain spaces, we've been getting more metal detectors, okay? So let's specifically go back to what can we do. Now, as I said to you earlier, I place a lot of this squarely at the feet of leaders. So I really advocate for an approach that talks about culturally responsive school leadership. At one let's talk about a concrete way of getting into that, is anti-racist leadership, which is what I was talking about earlier, is people have to interrogate these issues from their perspective, right? We have, and we know that over 80% of the teachers in America are white and female, and they come from spaces that are different than where we are seeing an increase in the number of students, which we have an increase in students of color, just to be clear. So when they come into those spaces, and I have to, as educators, we have to take some responsibilities. Sometimes we don't talk about culturally responsive approaches in our teacher ed programs, or we don't talk about them nearly enough, right? Same thing in our leadership programs. We don't talk about them. Some leadership programs in the country have no courses on equity or diversity. They just do leadership. Some people have told me that I don't understand why what race has to do with leadership. I'm like, that's my life. Let me talk to you, right? Right? Yeah. But if we get leaders who go into that space and suspend kids and say, these are the kids that are acting out without interrogating what's really happening, that becomes an issue. So you really have to interrogate who you are and how you do your work. Then we can start talking about some concrete approaches. There are things that we've done that are problematic. Whereas kids, when we have these tragedies, we almost can't find a counselor because we've been reducing the number of counselors in schools, right? They're tough, they're resilient, they have grit. They just had a school shooting yesterday. They'll bounce back. That only happens in certain communities, right? When that happened in Columbine, I'll go back to that. There were counselors everywhere, teams of counselors on site. We got to do something for these kids. But when tragedies happen in some urban schools, we're like, we're going back to the test scores. We're getting you ready for the test. Somebody got shot yesterday. I knew that kid. That was my cousin. That was my brother. Let's move on, right? Stay focused. Stay on task, right? So we got to start thinking about we've lost the humanity in certain educational spaces. And educators are the ones responsible for that. We're the ones who take classes on this stuff. Not school resource officers. They may or may not have had a course, right? They may or may not have talked to some educators. The other thing is we gotta really think differently about suspensions as a way of educating kids around what they did wrong. I encourage you to lean more toward restorative practices because those approaches restore harm, help kids understand what they did wrong, right? And keep them in the community. Right? I know it may be hard to believe, but I've not always been a saint, right? So, but when I acted out in school, they didn't kick me out of school because they know I love school. Here's a poor kid coming from the projects. I love to socialize. Had a problem talking, that's why I'm a professor now, right? Can you imagine suspending me and taking me out of my community? Now they disciplined me, but they said, you can stay here with us. But you gotta really work on your talking, Mark, right? But it wasn't like, go home. 2 days, 3 days, we don't want you here. And I knew from that they cared about me. I mean, and there's a refrain in my head that I hear all the time. The teacher say, you're acting out, you're acting like a clown. And they would say, you have a lot of potential. That's got me a long way. People I was like, yes, it's time to do the work because they said I have a lot of potential now, right? But think about all the brilliant kids who are now outside the education environment because some teachers said that these are the kids that we're supposed to get out. These are the kids who are supposed to be lined up in the office. These are the kids who are going to be, and people have said this. It's been documented. You're on your way to prison. Now, if we don't say that explicitly, what are we saying when we expel them or suspend them? Right? Kat Devereaux, one of my famous students from my race, leadership, and school to prison pipeline, we discuss these issues in detail. We examine who we are as educators and what we think about this. I go around the country all the time talking to educators, and there is no educator that has told me that suspensions work. When I ask them, do they work, they always say, no. And that's when kids come back to the environment, are they happy with you? Are they ready to learn? No, they're mad at me. Yeah. And the last point, you need to really know that you are really damaging the relationship when you do that. You want to preserve the relationship. You want them to be in relationship with you when you're teaching them. All right? I think that meant for me to move on.
So a couple of things. I'm thinking about how do you raise awareness and get voices of teachers and students and educators in general heard in the population at large. So I'm thinking about the teachers who struck for additional pay. I'm not suggesting anybody go on strike, but that was a way that what teachers saw as a problem, that is, they couldn't afford to be teachers, and if they left, there wouldn't be anybody to teach the kids in states like Kentucky. That caught national attention. I don't know what all the press has been, but they were successful. So again, I'm not proposing strike, but I'm wondering, because I think this has to be a broader conversation that involves people who aren't educators, who have to care and understand their responsibility, as well as not placing all the responsibility on teachers. So that's one piece. So how do we get the voices? How do we have a public how do we get the public to see this as part of their role and responsibility? How do we get them to care? And how do we magnify the voices of those who are in the schools? Framing the problem, I think, is so helpful. The obesity example, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the work that's been done in Chicago, looking at violence through a lens of epidemiology. And what came of it is the ceasefire program. I'm not going to go into detail, but it's a different way of looking at a problem that doesn't make it somebody's fault, that is looking at a network of support that prevents violence, or violence that's sort of irreparable, from happening, right? And figures out who are allies, who has street cred, who understands the sociology of what leads to the tit for tat, et cetera. I think that the larger conversation that at one end has people cause violence and at the other end guns cause violence is not going to get us there. I think a more complex analysis, certainly there's the issues of race and privilege that are pervasive and necessary. Also, what are the role of teachers versus what are the role of families, and how does the community support teaching? So it's a lift, but I think I'm convinced that I have participated in an organization called Better Angels, which creates conversations between folks who are supporters of red ideology and blue ideology, so brings people together to hear those stories. And when I saw a clip of people who'd been talking about gun violence in this Better Angels context, they came away saying, I understand how she got there. We have different views. She, grew up in a family of hunters. I don't agree with everything she said, but I see the validity and I see the humanity. So I think however we can get reframing the conversation so it's broader, more complex, bring in more people, and elevate the voice of teachers and educators.
Okay, so I'm working with pre-service teachers who are mainly juniors and seniors and a few grad students, and are reflective of the national demographic of the 80% of white teachers who have only really come to this issue through Columbine, Parkland, not Columbine, they actually were too young for that, but Parkland and Sandy Hook. So what's interesting there is this is their first exposure to the activism piece. So they've, on their own, have come up with some on-the-ground entry points that we're being very careful not to shut down. For example, they're looking at AR-15 gun legislation in our state, writing letters to Chris Murphy around what he's doing and inviting him in as a guest. So this is a student-run panel that are working on this activism program, and March for Our Lives was a piece of that. The teachers went, that was their first march. Arm Me With was another big one for them. Finding out about the Dickey Amendment and just starting to research and find out how, just for now, looking at a lens of, okay, what is gun legislation and where has it gone awry? And we've been very careful to kind of, in a constructivist way, follow that interest, but then hope to then illuminate the larger picture and the larger network of these issues that we're talking about here interdisciplinarily. And I feel that the School of Education's job or the university's job, it has an advantage of the built-in constellation of interdisciplinary experts who can model the more complex and bigger conversations that connect the issues, so that teachers who, especially the young teachers I'm working with, aren't discredited for their effort in something that may just be kind of putting a cork in the dam for the moment, but they're learning the civic engagement process. And we talked about that so much this morning, the importance of civics and practicing it and going through building capacity and practice and stamina to tackle difficult problems. And then those around us, around those folks and those teachers who are further along in the research and so on in the careers can kind of hold that container and expand it out and bring in more. So we're looking at it in that way too, which I'm calling constellation, but it sounds like it may be networks as well. But it's not to stop. I'm really careful not to say, well, that's not going to work. I don't think we're in a place right now to say, well, that's not going to work. Because if someone's got the light bulb on, then we need to keep it on and as we heard this morning, enrich that conversation and enrich the civic capacity and the civic dialogue. So though it may seem at times that everyone's like fragmented in a different direction, it says a lot that there are lots of things bubbling, and we'll continue to figure out how to knit those things together to build more strength.
We're going to open it up to questions, and one just perhaps bridging comment I wanted to offer is that last point, Jennifer, you just made, that it's not one set of issues and one set of problems, but that it's a complex set of, not complex set of, but a complex evolving multiple and intersecting realities that have at this point intersected in a way that brings some people's everyday lived realities into the fore because of other people's not everyday lived realities, and the kind of perfect storm of media response that has hopefully brought renewed attention to something that will help to reframe not just the way we talk about young people in certain situations. And like Trevon says, I mean, where is gun violence okay, right? Like if you were surprised by Parkland, why aren't you surprised by these other things? So I think that kind of both and multiplied many times is really what we have to hold together. So I think we're going to open it up to questions, and this gentleman had a question.
Okay. My name is Michael Gillespie, and I graduated from TC in '83 in leadership. And I worked for 43 years in education, retired from the City University of New York as a dean, and did not want to work anymore. But I came out of retirement because I got involved with a corporation that is working to reduce the incidence of bullying. And what I want to do now is just enrich the conversation, because I don't disagree with anything I've heard. But if you really look at the profiles of the young men who over these years from Columbine until the present have been involved in the shootings, the mass shootings in schools, 90% of them have been bullied. And that's being pushed aside because of the gun violence issue, which I truly understand. But in the corporation where I'm now doing some work, I came out of retirement to do this work, we are now doing some of the things that you all have been talking about. Part of the problem with bullies is that they feel they have no voice. There's no one to tell or no one to empathize with them, that they have been bullied, that they have been harassed, that they have been manipulated in very negative ways. We just had an incident in the Bronx in the fall in which a young man killed one of his classmates and injured another one very critically because the two classmates had been bullying him since the beginning of the fall term. And they were bullying him because he's gay. And he felt he had no one to go to, no one to talk about with the problems he was having. He got money from wherever. I think he was working at McDonald's or a place like that. He saved $30. He sent away for a very disturbing type of knife. And the rest is, most of us know the rest. He stabbed two of his classmates one day in the classroom. So our group, which is called Bridget, and it's called Bridget because we bridge the bullied to the school authorities. What we have done is to create an app for the telephone, for the smartphone, or handheld device, that kids K through 12, any of them can use it. Even the kindergartners can do it because it's icon driven. And they can file a report on their phone confidentially to tell their principal that they have been bullied. The principal and the head of guidance. You know, we've known about many of these things that you all have been talking about. The principal and the head of guidance investigate these reports, and they are able to tell whether they are pranks or if they're serious. And let me just say to you, let me get to the bottom line of this. Two things happen. First, they find out the validity of the report, they investigate it, and they get back to the one who said he or she was bullied. To that child's satisfaction. And they get back to the parents, because the parents are involved in this system that has been set up in the school. The second thing is we use restorative practices, as Professor Gooden said. We have over 2,000 restorative educational materials that have been curated in an electronic library. When the child files the report, the electronic system pushes out the resources in our library that that particular child needs. So the bottom line of this is that 3 weeks ago, we were able to save a girl's life. She was going to commit suicide, 6th grade. She filed a report in her school where she said to the principal, my friend is going to commit suicide. The principal took it quite seriously. This was on a Saturday. Called the head of guidance on that Saturday afternoon. They intervened, and the little girl did not go through with committing the suicide. So all I'm really trying to say is everything that I've heard this afternoon is absolutely true. Yeah. But at the same time, we have to understand that a lot of kids don't feel they have a voice. They don't feel they have a voice at all for many reasons, including culturally diverse pedagogy. And we have worked on this system for the past 7 years, and we're beginning to get real results. In a school that was in total chaos in Brooklyn, in middle school in Brooklyn, we worked, I won't say the number, but we worked with them for 4 years. Over those 4 years, there has been a 75% decrease in bullying and in violent incidents. So it's not just about the gun violence. That's a manifestation of it. That's a manifestation.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Don Myers, and just got admitted here in health education. I'm actually teaching in Tucson, Arizona right now, and Tucson's kind of an interesting place because most of my kids, I'm a high school teacher, and most of my kids were born post 9/11. So all they know is violence. It's become a part of their daily lives. They've been desensitized to it in some aspects. And I want to kind of tailor on that, the bullying thing. I grew up in LA, and in my opinion as a high school teacher, this generation is more inclusive than my generation was. I actually see a lot less bullying than I went through in high school in the 90s. But the problem is we don't have anyone that listens to the kids or us as teachers. Like, this program would be great, but they make it a school problem. Bullying has become a school problem, and so we often get blamed as teachers. Why aren't you stopping the bullying? The children are getting blamed. Why are you guys bullying each other? But where's the resources coming from outside to help stop that problem? Because I think it's so much blame put in the educational system. In Arizona, we are considering a strike as teachers, and we're called pansies. we're called crybabies, are, you know, just like the students there, are talked about as, I went to the March for Our Lives, I traveled to DC, and all we hear, when I talk to my kids about it in the classroom, they tell me, Miss, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we think because nobody's gonna listen to us. And so that's how they feel. So I feel like, yeah, bullying in schools is a problem, but society is bullying that generation. They think all they care about is video games and the Kardashians, when there's eloquent children out there that have a voice, but we don't listen. So how do we get society to listen to not just the students, but the people that are in the classrooms with the students every day that do listen? Like, how do we get other people involved?
Hi, my name is Jennifer Ervolino. I'm on the Alumni Council with Michael, who just eloquently spoke before. My nephew / godson was a survivor of Sandy Hook. He was in the school the day of the shooting. And my sister-in-law, well, I was watching the news and telling her on the phone, and we were texting because all she got was that robocall. And what was even worse is that they lived down the street from the kid that did the shooting, and my other nephew went to school with him, high school with him, so they knew the family. It was a day of horrors. My nephew, godson, he's now a few years older, and it's complicated. During those days after the shooting, he was in 4th grade when it happened. The last year, he lost his principal, he lost his teachers he knew, he lost friends, he lost kids that my niece babysat for. And he went through things such as bedwetting and sleeping with his parents, and he wanted to read books from his childhood, like when he was 3 years old. And unfortunately, things have not gotten better. He has dropped out of high school at 15 years of age. And I guess the point I want to make is this, is that while all of you on the panel expressed very, great ideas and to put into action, it's very complicated, and especially dealing with a 15-year-old boy's survivor's guilt, if you will, is what he has. And that was one of the reasons he said, I hate going to high school when kids that I was in the school with can't be there. He feels guilty. And this is not going to just end at this. I don't know if he'll go back to high school. He's getting therapy and such, but he's not the only one. And what happens, and I think we all know, is that it's not only happening, this is going to follow his life. All these kids that are impacted, they're going to become adults. And then how does that just sit with you for the rest of your life? How do you get on track? Some people can. Some of these individuals who spoke in Washington, they have taken it and pushed it forward in a positive. But for every one of them, there's probably a ton more that are not doing that, and they're sitting alone, and they maybe have guilt or they have feelings they can't articulate, and they don't have access to resources that can help them. So I say this for my nephew, godson's sake, is that, well, it's a very complicated issue. I pray that he gets on the right track one day, and so do any of the other people impacted by such violence that has happened.
You're underscoring, and I can imagine a number of our panelists could speak to this, but first of all, I feel a deep sorrow for your nephew, and thank you for sharing that, because I think it's one of the things that I think compels and impels many of us on here. Sorry, I have this. Impels many of us on here to even have this conversation. That is, it is not a single moment, but it's the lingering traces of that trauma that manifests in so many different ways that, at the very least, a recognition of that underscores the urgency with which all of us have to be concerned, rather than leaving it to particular communities or particular phases. And I think the over-reliance on resilience as a response to trauma has dominated the discourse. And then the other piece seems to be these ineffective but catchy kind of Band-Aid responses. So I know that that was hard to share, and I appreciate you sharing that, but I just want to say if anybody else wants to.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. So first, thank you for sharing. Just sort of something that I know some of us have been talking about, and that I think speaks to what you beautifully articulated, which is how are we operationalizing gun violence? And I think that's a really important piece, not just as researchers, but also from an advocacy perspective. So, right now, like we tend to use very broadly, but the government, surveillance systems, public health professionals tend to quantify gun violence really in terms of number of deaths and number of injuries. That's really the only kind of data we collect in any sort of meaningful way. The DOE, to speak to what Mark was saying earlier and others, for a long time they were collecting data on the number of kids expelled in a given year because they brought a gun to school, to which I think both Lalitha and I looked at each other and said, did anyone ask the kid why they brought a gun to school? I mean, when we really talk about hearing their voices, their stories, their experiences, gun violence is the early antecedents of gun violence, the bullying, the sort of aggressive behaviors or experiences earlier on. It's all of that leading up to the acts of gun violence, witnessing someone go through that, hearing gunshots, knowing a friend or a family member who was killed or injured or anything like that, and then of course the subsequent the survivor piece and what does that even look like? And there's so much we don't know, and I think, as I share this with my students all the time, but I think as advocates, certainly on this issue in terms of wanting resources and support and awareness of this, a lot of what may be helpful is also acknowledging with some sort of collective voice on this that gun violence cannot simply be the number of people shot in a given day. And even just hearing that in and of itself should be enough, right, to warrant and garner change. But to understand the true ramification is absolutely what I think brings all of us to work every day. I think that drives a lot of our work. So I just wanted to share that kind of in response to what you were sharing. Yeah, this is a tough space, right? So.
I don't know if I can add anything to this, because a lot of good people are working so hard, including, I think it's great, your idea. But the teacher's alone in a classroom, and she loves all the students, but one child could be very difficult. Other kids have their own problems. So it's hard for her to be, it has to be an effort where the principal doesn't go against the teacher, it's supportive of the teacher. The guidance counselor should be there. And the records don't always follow. I don't know if you're aware of that. When a child goes from one school to the next, the records don't follow him. So it may take another new 6 months to get to know the child. So it has to be really a concerted effort. And sure, it's nice to be understanding why is the child bullying and why is you, but the teacher still has to teach. Forget about doing the tests. I mean, still has to be a teacher and has responsibility to all the students and to have them feel protected too. But I think it has to be an incredible effort and an awareness in every book she reads that goes in that classroom, every movie that goes in the classroom, has to go against all these violent movies outside of the Kardashians. Everything that the child is witness to in the curriculum should be building up that effort. And still, you could still miss the child. But I'm saying it has to be an incredibly intense thing. I myself did a documentary about the Holocaust, and I'm amazed at the reaction I get when I show it, because I myself, I don't want to get personal about this, but technically I'm a Holocaust survivor. But the conversations afterwards, how could it happen? How did it happen? How did it get out of control? And this is really what has to be faced. It isn't just the teacher alone or the principal alone, but it has to be like not 100%, I think 1,000% to help a child change also. It's very difficult. And thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I just add a couple of things because I don't want this to be missed. We're in support of teachers. We're in support of teachers getting the training that they need, and the same thing for leaders. Teaching is a hard job. Serving as an administrator, this is really difficult work, and it's multifaceted, and you go in there and you do your best every day, and then you find, even this way in which teachers are really highly criticized by people who really know nothing about what it means to go in the classroom every day. Right. So we want to be really clear that we're in support of those folks, and yes, this is complex work, but in that, what we find when we start to really get in and look at the process and really work with folks and try to help them develop and really base this on empirical work is oftentimes there are a number of things that we still can be doing in these environments. I wish I could tell you that I pop up in places and have had opportunities to talk to leaders, and that when I bring up a lot of what I'm saying to you, that more often than not people are saying, yes, we got it, we get it. I think there's a sort of inherent understanding of this, but we've done them a disservice by not following up with how do you do this. We're not following up with how do you really support your students without using this process of suspension. Because oftentimes we give people that, and here's a poor way of implementing this work. I was in Pittsburgh, my days run together, it was sometimes earlier this week, doing some work with the Center for Urban Ed there, and there were a number of educators in this space. And what somebody had decided at the policy level is, we're going to get rid of suspensions. We're no longer doing that. People like Gooden say it's disproportionality and they're bad. We're going to stop doing it. And then they say that to the teachers. And then they say, you're not doing any more suspensions. Now, what's the problem with that approach? I'll tell you, if the kids are going to misbehave in class, and teachers are going to want to, what should I do? Now, because they have been mentally trained to do and think suspensions, they're thinking, well, I don't have anything else to do. My class is out of order. It's crazy. Because we didn't follow up with the support. And we've done that multiple times. When LA Unified implemented restorative practices some years ago, it broke my heart to read that teachers were feeling like, they told us don't do any more suspensions, and this equals restorative practices. I don't like restorative practices, right? Because for them, that was a tool that they learned to use over the years, and nobody really went back and said, here's how we're going to support you, right? Here's how we're going to teach you how to. I mean, I would fail miserably at my job. They said, you just have to go get tenure. No roadmap for that, right? I needed mentors. I needed people to help me understand exactly what that meant. I mean, I need, and I have to say, there are institutions, so now I have an inside joke going, that do that to assistant professors. And oftentimes those folks are not successful. So if we want teachers to be successful, if we want leaders to be successful, we've got to use the same types of approaches. We've got to treat them with care. We can't beat these folks over the head. This is a hard job, right? They sign up for this, and they want our support. So I just wanted to make sure that that's a point that we want to make. This is a complex job, and we should be celebrating these folks, not beating them over the head, saying, they don't know what they're doing, and, we're going to give them a gun so they can shoot the folks coming. Come on, really?
I got the signal that we are out of time. I first just want to thank everybody for being here, for your time, for your questions. You're beating me to the punch. I want to thank our very, very thoughtful and I think committed panelists. And I want to end with just a thought, and that is, I hope we leave you with a sense of not just the complicated and complex and nuanced and multifaceted landscape of what constitutes gun violence, but that response can be at multiple levels. That response can be at the policy and legislative level. That response can come at the leadership of an institution level. That response can come from organizations that exist, but also by perhaps reorganizing groups of people to interact with one another. That response can come at the everyday interaction level. And that response can come in the form of the stories we tell and the stories we circulate. So I hope you carry one of those layers of response with you, and I hope you continue to see your role as part of stemming this epidemic as well. So thank you for being here.